when the narrative becomes stronger than the analysis. Let me explain a few perspectives from social psychology and media studies related to social media. These are mechanisms many people will recognize, either in their own media habits or in how others navigate digital communities. For me, having spent more than 11 years working with and studying blockchain technology and cryptocurrency, and having engaged early with projects such as Ripple, Ethereum, Cardano, and many others, both as an investor and as an analytically interested participant, it has always been essential to understand the underlying mechanisms of the technology, not just individual projects in isolation, but the systems, incentives, and structures surrounding them. From this perspective, it becomes clear that although this knowledge has been available for some time, much of it remains new to most people. It is this gap between technological and financial complexity and general understanding that forms the starting point for this discussion. To illustrate this more concretely, I will refer to certain profiles within the XRP ecosystem. Profiles such as Jake Claver and Tom Lareska serve here as examples of a broader psychological and media ecological phenomenon. The point is not the individuals themselves, but the patterns they represent. It is worth emphasizing that my own reaction to such narratives has also changed over time. What previously could feel provocative or frustrating now appears primarily as analytically interesting, not because the content itself has necessarily changed, but because understanding the underlying psychological mechanisms has made it possible to view the phenomenon with greater distance. Let us consider a few concrete examples many will recognize. Claims that XRP will reach extremely high price levels, such as $10,000 per token, or narratives suggesting that Ripple will, in practice, take over the global financial system. These kinds of statements are often delivered with a high degree of certainty, whether they concern extreme price targets or sweeping changes to the financial system. At the same time, they are rarely presented with clear assumptions. Typically, there are no explicit timeframes, no coherent model for how value creation would realistically occur within existing financial structures, and no clear criteria for what would, in practice, falsify the claims. From a psychological perspective, this can be understood as an example of what is known as narrative closure. Complex and open questions are given a finished story that feels explanatory and conclusive, without the underlying assumptions being made explicit or subject to verification. The interesting question, therefore, is not whether XRP can or cannot reach such price levels, or whether Ripple will actually take over the financial system as we know it today. What matters is how these claims are presented. Instead of being framed as hypotheses, meaning statements that can be tested, nuanced, or rejected, they are often presented as convictions, as completed narratives, something one either sees or is said to lack sufficient insight to understand. This form of communication has significant psychological effects. When complex technological and financial systems are reduced to simple, emotionally charged conclusions, a sense of insight and control emerges. The narrative provides meaning, direction, and hope, especially in markets characterized by high uncertainty. The authority established through such narratives is not primarily epistemic. It is not grounded first and foremost in truth value or methodological verification, but in perceived coherence. In uncertain times, this is often experienced as more important than precision. For audiences who have invested time, identity, and often financial resources into such narratives, a well-known psychological phenomenon emerges when information challenges the story. This phenomenon is known in psychology as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance describes the mental discomfort that arises when new observations or facts conflict with established beliefs. To reduce this discomfort, individuals often protect the narrative rather than reevaluate it. Critical objections may then be experienced as threatening rather than informative. Live formats amplify this dynamic further. They facilitate parasocial relationships, meaning a perceived sense of closeness and trust toward the presenter. When a narrative is repeated over time and rarely confronted with clear counterarguments, a closed informational environment develops in which consistency gradually becomes more important than correctness. This is not a cult in the traditional sense, but it can be described as a low-intensity cult-like dynamic. This does not necessarily mean that the communicators involved are consciously spreading falsehoods. Often they themselves believe the narrative they are presenting. However, the system they operate within does not reward uncertainty, reservations, or methodological doubt. It rewards confidence, and confidence is not the same as truth. This discussion is not intended to persuade nor to rescue anyone. It is intended to provide a language. A useful starting point is to ask a few simple questions. Do claims ever become clearly wrong, or are they merely adjusted over time? Is uncertainty rewarded or punished? And does what I am hearing prioritize analysis or the feeling of being right? The most interesting question, however, remains. What happens on the day the narrative can no longer be sustained? When the price levels presented as inevitable fail to materialize? when the financial system remains far more complex and resilient than the story suggested. In such moments, psychological discomfort often reaches its peak because it is no longer just a claim being challenged, but identity, belonging, and self understanding. Cognitive dissonance reaches its highest level, and the individual faces a choice either to reassess the narrative or to reinforce it further. Historically, many choose the latter. The explanation is moved further into the future. Responsibility is reassigned. New narratives are built on the remains of the old ones, not because they offer better explanations, but because they are psychologically less costly than acknowledging that one was wrong. This is precisely why understanding these mechanisms is so important. Not to win a debate, but to preserve the ability to think critically, even when hope, group pressure, and emotional investment pull in the opposite direction. Because when dealing with complex systems, it is not those who are most certain who understand the most. It is those who can tolerate uncertainty long enough to let analysis come first. When we understand the mechanism, the narrative loses some of its power over us. Only then does it become possible to analyze again, instead of believing blindly. Regardless of XRP's future, these psychological mechanisms remain real, operative, and essential to understand. If you're interested in cryptocurrency, blockchain, and the psychological mechanisms that shape how we think, decide, and sometimes mislead ourselves, follow for analysis without hype.